Across snow-laden peaks and misty forests, ordinary moments erupt into chaos when bears strike without warning. Territory, hunger, and instinct collide in terrifying precision, turning rivers, camps, and cabins into battlegrounds. From Alaska's wild trails to Russia's frozen outposts, each encounter grows more unpredictable. In this video, witness 6 chilling bear attacks that redefine survival in the wilderness. On October 2, 2025, in the vast wilderness of interior Alaska, Park Ranger Lucas Freeman found himself stationed at one of the most isolated monitoring posts in North America. At 41 years old, Freeman had spent nearly 2 decades working in Alaska's backcountry. Still, nothing in his extensive experience would prepare him for what his equipment was about to document. The area had a storied history among both wildlife biologists and indigenous communities. For generations, the local Athabascan peoples had spoken of enormous bears that ruled these streams during the salmon runs, creatures so massive that even experienced hunters treated their territories with profound respect. Modern wildlife management had documented several impressively large grizzlies in the region over the years, but recent sightings suggested something truly exceptional might be prowling the salmon streams that season. Freeman's primary objective that crisp October morning was straightforward enough. He needed to position trail cameras at strategic points along a particularly productive stretch of stream, gathering data on grizzly populations and feeding behaviors. The research would help inform management decisions and ensure that human activity in surrounding areas remained at safe distances from critical bear habitat. He had selected a location where the stream narrowed between 2 rocky outcrops, creating a natural funnel that concentrated salmon and consequently attracted the largest predators. The setup process took Freeman roughly 90 minutes. He secured the weatherproof camera housing to a sturdy spruce tree, angling it to capture the prime feeding areas along the stream bank. The device, equipped with motion sensors and night vision capabilities, would operate autonomously for weeks, documenting whatever wildlife passed through its field of view. After double-checking the mounting brackets and testing the trigger mechanism, Freeman collected his gear and hiked back toward his base camp, satisfied with the positioning. Over the following 3 weeks, the camera silently captured the dramatic spectacle of Alaska's autumn wildlife. The footage showed the expected parade of grizzlies, ranging from cautious juveniles to confident adults, all capitalizing on the salmon bonanza. Black bears occasionally appeared at the periphery, though they typically maintained respectful distances from their larger cousins. Eagles perched in nearby trees, waiting for opportunities to scavenge scraps. The ecosystem hummed with the ancient rhythms of predator and prey. Then, on October 24th, when Freeman retrieved the camera's memory card and began reviewing the footage back at his station, he noticed something extraordinary in the timestamp from 3 days prior. The file showed an absolutely colossal grizzly bear approaching the stream during the late afternoon golden hour. The animal moved with the deliberate confidence of an apex predator that had never encountered a serious challenge. Freeman immediately began analyzing the bear's size relative to known reference points in the frame. Using a boulder near the stream bank that he had previously measured, Freeman calculated rough estimates of the bear's dimensions. The mathematics were staggering. The grizzly appeared to stand nearly 5 feet at the shoulder while on all fours, and its body stretched well over 9 feet from nose to tail. The massive head seemed almost disproportionate, even for a grizzly, with a distinctive silvered hump rippling with muscle across the shoulders. Freeman's preliminary weight estimate, based on body measurements and a comparative analysis with documented specimens, suggested that the animal weighed more than 1,600 pounds, surpassing the weight of any grizzly previously recorded in the region. The footage that followed proved even more remarkable. As the massive bear approached the prime fishing spot, a large adult male grizzly, itself probably weighing 800 pounds, was actively feeding on salmon. The smaller bear initially seemed oblivious to the approaching giant, focused entirely on extracting maximum calories from the abundant fish. When the enormous grizzly finally entered the other bear's peripheral vision, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The resident bear abandoned its meal instantly, but rather than fleeing, it adopted an aggressive defensive posture. Freeman watched, transfixed, as the 2 males engaged in a territorial display of raw power. The smaller grizzly lunged forward, attempting to assert dominance through intimidation, but the giant responded with shocking speed for an animal of such bulk. A massive paw swipe, executed with casual brutality, sent the challenger stumbling backward. The confrontation escalated rapidly, with both bears rearing onto hind legs, swiping and lunging in a dangerous dance that scattered salmon carcasses across the rocky shore. The dominant bear, the colossal newcomer, demonstrated fighting techniques honed through years of successful territorial disputes. It used its superior weight to control positioning, forcing the rival toward less favorable terrain while blocking access to the richest salmon concentrations. After several intense minutes of conflict, punctuated by guttural roars that the camera's audio sensors captured despite being designed primarily for silent recording, the smaller male finally conceded defeat. The challenger retreated downstream, periodically glancing back as if calculating whether a renewed assault might prove worthwhile, but ultimately disappearing into the thick alder brush lining the waterway. With the territory secured, the massive grizzly settled into feeding with impressive efficiency. Smaller bears, including 2 females with cubs that had been fishing further upstream, immediately altered their positions, maintaining substantial buffer zones from the dominant male. The giant consumed salmon after salmon, its powerful jaws crushing through bones with audible cracks picked up by the camera's sensitive microphone. Freeman estimated the bear consumed approximately 40 pounds of salmon during the 90-minute feeding session captured on video. When Freeman reported his findings to the wildlife authorities, the response was mixed, with excitement tempered by caution. Officials reviewed the footage extensively, confirming that the bear represented an exceptional specimen, possibly the largest grizzly documented in Alaska's interior regions. However, after extensive discussions about public safety and wildlife management, authorities made a controversial decision. They would not release the footage publicly or disclose the specific location where Freeman had positioned his camera. The reasoning centered on predictable human behavior. Previous instances where exceptional wildlife had been documented and publicized had resulted in floods of curious visitors, photographers, and thrill-seekers descending on remote locations. Such human presence inevitably disrupted natural behaviors, created dangerous wildlife encounters, and occasionally resulted in animals being destroyed when they became habituated to human presence or involved in conflicts. Officials emphasized that grizzlies of such magnitude, while awe-inspiring, remained fundamentally unpredictable and dangerous. Wildlife biologists involved in reviewing Freeman's documentation stressed the behavioral insights the footage provided. Territorial disputes over concentrated food resources could trigger extreme aggression, even among apex predators accustomed to dominance. The massive bear's willingness to engage in potentially injurious combat over fishing rights demonstrated the critical importance of autumn feeding for grizzlies preparing for hibernation. Every pound of fat accumulated during the salmon runs directly impacted winter survival and spring emergence conditions. Freeman continued monitoring the location throughout the remainder of the season. Still, the giant grizzly appeared on camera only twice more before the salmon runs concluded and the bears dispersed to their winter denning sites. The ranger kept detailed notes, contributing valuable data to long-term population studies, while the footage itself remained secured in official archives. The experience reinforced for Freeman something he had always understood intellectually but now grasped on a deeper level. Alaska's wilderness still harbored creatures of almost mythical proportions, reminders that humans remained visitors in domains ruled by forces older and more powerful than civilization could fully comprehend. On October 20th, 2022, the rugged coastline of Kodiak Island presented itself in typical autumn fashion, gray skies merging with slate-colored waters, punctuated by the occasional cry of seabirds wheeling overhead. Ethan Walker, a 42-year-old outdoor enthusiast from Oregon, had arrived on the island 3 days earlier with his longtime friend, Marcus Chen, for what they envisioned as the kayaking adventure of a lifetime. Kodiak Island's history stretched back thousands of years, with Alutiiq people having inhabited its shores long before Russian explorers arrived in the 18th century. The island's ecosystem had evolved in relative isolation, producing the famous Kodiak bears that regularly exceeded 1,200 pounds, with some males reaching truly massive proportions. The salmon runs that fed these giants occurred in predictable patterns each year, drawing bears to coastal streams and inlets where the fish congregated in extraordinary numbers. Walker and Chen had been meticulously planning their expedition for nearly 18 months. Their goal was to circumnavigate a particularly scenic section of coastline, camping at designated spots and documenting their journey through photography and video. Both men had extensive kayaking experience, having tackled challenging waters from Baja California to the Inside Passage, but neither had encountered Kodiak bears in their natural habitat. They had attended a mandatory bear safety briefing, purchased bear-resistant food containers, and equipped themselves with bear spray, believing these precautions would prove sufficient. The morning of October 20th began unremarkably. The two kayakers broke camp shortly after dawn, paddling along a secluded inlet flanked by dense Sitka spruce forest. The water remained calm, barely rippling as their paddles cut through the surface in synchronized strokes. They had successfully caught several sizable salmon the previous evening, storing the cleaned fish in waterproof bags attached to the rear storage compartments of their kayaks. The decision to keep the fish, rather than immediately consuming or properly storing them at a greater distance from their persons, would prove catastrophic. Around mid-morning, as they navigated close to shore to examine interesting rock formations, Chen noticed movement in the tree line approximately 50 yards ahead. Before either man could react meaningfully, a massive Kodiak bear exploded from the vegetation, covering the distance to the narrow beach with shocking speed. The bear, an adult male likely exceeding 1,300 pounds based on later estimates, had clearly been drawn by the scent of salmon permeating the air around the kayakers. The bear plunged into the shallow water without hesitation, creating enormous splashes that rocked both kayaks violently. Walker, paddling slightly ahead of Chen, took the initial impact as the bear swiped at his vessel with terrifying force. The kayak capsized immediately, dumping Walker into the frigid water. He surfaced, gasping, the cold shocking his system, and attempted to swim toward a rocky outcrop protruding from the water about 15 feet away. Chen, reacting with the instinct born from years of outdoor experience, backpaddled frantically, trying to create distance between himself and the attacking bear. The animal, however, remained fixated on Walker, perhaps because he was closer or because the overturned kayak had released a stronger concentration of fish scent into the water. Walker managed to grasp the rocks and began pulling himself upward, his waterlogged clothing and boots making each movement exhaustingly difficult. The bear reached the outcrop within seconds. Standing partially upright in the chest-deep water, the animal swiped at Walker with devastating power. The first blow struck Walker's shoulder and upper back. The bear's claws, each several inches long, penetrating through his protective layers and inflicting deep lacerations. Walker lost his grip and slid backward. The bear swiped again, this time connecting with Walker's torso and head, the crushing impact causing catastrophic injuries. Chen, now approximately 40 yards away, screamed Walker's name repeatedly while fumbling for his marine radio. The bear, seemingly satisfied that the immediate threat or competition for the fish had been neutralized, turned its attention briefly toward the overturned kayak, biting at the storage compartments where the strongest salmon smell originated. After perhaps 30 seconds of investigation, the bear waded back toward shore and disappeared into the forest as suddenly as it had appeared. Chen immediately radioed for emergency assistance, providing coordinates and describing the situation in a voice shaking with adrenaline and horror. He carefully paddled back toward the outcrop, though the approach required agonizing minutes as he needed to ensure the bear had truly departed. When he reached Walker, it became immediately apparent that his friend had not survived the attack. The injuries were simply too severe, the blood loss too rapid. Rescue personnel arrived by helicopter approximately 90 minutes later. Still, it could only recover Walker's body and transport Chen, who was suffering from severe shock and hypothermia, despite not being physically attacked himself. The investigation that followed examined every detail of the encounter. Wildlife officials noted that the combination of factors, salmon in proximity to the kayakers, the confined geography of the inlet, the bear's size and presumably empty stomach given the time of day, and the men's position between the bear and water, had created a nearly perfect storm of circumstances for a deadly encounter. The incident prompted renewed discussions about safety protocols for kayakers in Kodiak bear territory. Experts emphasized that even seemingly tranquil coastal waters could transform into lethal arenas when humans inadvertently position themselves between apex predators and concentrated food sources. The official report concluded that Walker's death, although tragic, resulted from an unfortunate convergence of factors rather than reckless behavior. However, the decision to keep fresh fish attached to the kayaks was identified as a critical mistake. Chen returned to Oregon shortly after providing his statement to authorities. He struggled with profound survivor's guilt and never kayaked again, the memory of that October morning having permanently altered his relationship with wilderness recreation. Family and friends remembered Walker as an adventurous spirit who had died doing what he loved. However, the manner of his death served as a sobering reminder that Alaska's wilderness demanded not just respect, but perfect awareness of the constant presence of creatures to whom humans represented, at best, unwelcome competition and at worst, potential threats to be eliminated. On August 18, 2025, the small rural community nestled in the hills of western Maine experienced one of those late summer days that reminded residents why they endured the harsh winters. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, temperatures hovering in the low 80s. Daniel Harris, a 37-year-old former software engineer who had relocated from Boston 3 years earlier, was inside his modest farmhouse when he heard the unmistakable sound of something crashing in his greenhouse. The region where Harris had built his homestead had a complicated relationship with black bears. Unlike their grizzly cousins in the western states, black bears in Maine rarely exceeded 400 pounds, but their intelligence and adaptability made them particularly challenging neighbors for anyone attempting to farm. The forests surrounding Harris's property provided ideal habitat for bears that had learned to exploit human food sources. Harris had invested considerable effort into his greenhouse operation. The structure, measuring roughly 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, represented his primary source of supplemental income. He grew heirloom tomatoes, various pepper varieties, and specialty herbs that he sold at farmers' markets throughout the region. When Harris rushed outside, he discovered a large black bear had breached the greenhouse's entrance. The animal, probably weighing close to 300 pounds, was systematically working its way through rows of ripening tomatoes. Soil scattered across the concrete walkway, overturned pots leaked water, and several trays of pepper seedlings lay crushed beneath the bear's bulk. Harris's initial reaction combined outrage with a significant underestimation of danger. He grabbed a push broom and stormed toward the greenhouse, shouting and waving the broom above his head. The bear, momentarily startled, turned its attention from the tomatoes. Harris, emboldened by the bear's hesitation, stepped inside the greenhouse and swung the broom in wide arcs, trying to drive the animal toward the entrance. The bear's response shattered any illusion Harris harbored about controlling the situation. Moving with shocking speed, the animal lunged forward and swiped at Harris with its right paw. The claws raked across Harris's forearms and shoulders as he instinctively raised the broom defensively. The plastic handle snapped like kindling, and Harris stumbled backward, pain exploding across his upper body. Blood immediately began soaking through Harris's shirt. The bear, rather than pressing the attack, seemed to interpret the encounter as resolved in its favor. It returned attention to the food, climbing onto one of the raised growing benches. Harris, clutching his injured arms and experiencing genuine fear, backpedaled until he reached the greenhouse's rear wall. The bear proceeded to overturn additional trays, scattering starter plants across the benches. It sampled various items, biting into bell peppers and rejecting several before finding varieties it preferred. The animal's behavior suggested this was not its first greenhouse raid. It moved through the space with confidence, targeting the most calorie-dense options. Harris remained frozen against the wall, increasingly aware that his injuries required attention, but terrified that movement might trigger another attack. The bear's massive head swung periodically in his direction, checking his position. The standoff continued for perhaps 5 minutes. Salvation arrived in the form of Harris's 2 mixed-breed dogs, who burst through the dog door and began barking with frantic intensity. They maintained a safe distance but created sufficient noise to unnerve the bear. Harris, seizing the opportunity, started banging his fists against the greenhouse's metal support frame, adding to the cacophony. The combined assault proved effective. The animal dropped the pepper it had been eating and crashed through a side panel that Harris had left partially open for ventilation. The plastic sheeting tore easily, and within seconds the animal had disappeared into the dense underbrush. Harris waited another full minute before moving. Once inside the farmhouse, Harris assessed his injuries with shaking hands. The claw marks were deep enough to require immediate medical attention, though they had missed major blood vessels. He wrapped the wounds in clean towels and drove himself to the nearest emergency clinic, located approximately 20 miles away. The attending physician cleaned and stitched the lacerations, prescribed antibiotics, and filed the mandatory wildlife incident report. The investigation included a site visit from a wildlife biologist who examined the damage. The official noted evidence suggesting the bear had visited the property multiple times over the preceding weeks, likely scouting during nighttime hours. Scratch marks on the greenhouse frame indicated the bear had tested various entry points before finding the vulnerable ventilation panel. The biologist emphasized that black bears could become dangerously bold when they associated specific locations with concentrated food sources. Harris faced difficult decisions in the aftermath. The greenhouse required extensive repairs, his late-season crop was largely destroyed, and resuming operations would require significant security upgrades. Officials recommended installing electric fencing, reinforcing entry points, and immediately removing any produce at peak ripeness. The physical wounds healed within weeks, leaving Harris with impressive scars and a profoundly altered perspective on rural living. He had moved to Maine seeking a connection with nature, never imagining that nature might literally break into his workspace and assert dominance. The encounter reinforced lessons that longtime rural residents understood intuitively. Even relatively small wild animals commanded respect. Aggression toward wildlife typically escalated danger, and the boundaries between human and wild spaces remained far more permeable than city transplants generally appreciated. On October 16, 2025, the small medical facility serving Russia's remote Amur region operated under conditions that would have seemed impossible to healthcare workers in developed areas. The hospital, located approximately 200 kilometers from the nearest significant town, provided essential services to logging communities and indigenous villages with a permanent staff of just 8 people. The single-story structure, built during the Soviet era and minimally updated since, functioned in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. The Amur region, stretching along the border with China, has witnessed dramatic ecological changes over recent decades. Deforestation and shifting climate patterns brought apex predators into increasingly frequent contact with human settlements. Regional brown bears, close relatives of North American grizzlies and capable of exceeding 600 kilograms, had demonstrated growing boldness as natural food sources became less predictable. Local authorities have documented a rise in incidents of bears raiding garbage dumps and approaching inhabited buildings with increasing confidence. Elena Smirnova, a 38-year-old nurse who had worked at the facility for 12 years, was well aware of these risks. She had treated numerous patients suffering injuries from wildlife encounters and participated in discussions about improving security measures that never materialized due to budget constraints. On that October morning, Smirnova arrived for her shift at 7 o'clock, noting the unusual amount of food waste near the kitchen's exterior door. The hospital's waste management represented a persistent vulnerability. Budget limitations meant proper secured containers remained unavailable, and staff relied on metal barrels positioned behind the building. The previous evening's meal preparation had generated considerable organic waste, including fish remains, creating a scent beacon that carried for kilometers. A massive male brown bear, estimated to weigh approximately 550 kilograms, had detected the smell and spent hours investigating the hospital's perimeter. Around mid-morning, Smirnova was transporting medical supplies from the treatment area to a storage room along the building's eastern corridor. The hospital's layout included several exterior doors with locks that were corroded by harsh weather and frequently failed to latch properly. Smirnova balanced a cardboard box containing bandages and medications as she navigated the narrow hallway. The bear, having tested various entry points, finally forced open the side door nearest the kitchen. The metal door, weakened by rust and a damaged frame, yielded to the animal's persistent shoving. The bear entered the corridor cautiously, its massive bulk barely fitting through the doorway. The interior space, filled with unfamiliar scents of disinfectant, initially caused the animal to hesitate. Smirnova heard the crash as the door burst inward, followed by the sound of something large moving through the corridor. She turned, still holding her box, and found herself facing the enormous bear at perhaps 10 meters. For a frozen moment, neither moved. Then Smirnova dropped the box, supplies scattering across the floor, and attempted to retreat toward the treatment area. The bear, startled by the sudden movement and clattering objects, reacted with explosive aggression. It charged forward with terrifying speed despite the confined space. One massive paw swiped at a metal cart, sending it tumbling with a tremendous crash. Smirnova managed only a few steps before the bear reached her. The animal's first swipe caught Smirnova across her back and shoulders, slamming her against the corridor wall. She collapsed, attempting to curl into a protective position, but the bear continued its assault. A second swipe connected with her side and head, inflicting catastrophic injuries. The bear, operating on pure instinct in an environment that probably terrified it, seemed unable to disengage from its prey. Screams erupted as staff members and patients realized what was occurring. Dr. Mikhail Volkov, the facility's senior physician, emerged from an examination room and triggered the emergency alarm system, producing an ear-splitting wail. Several staff members began shouting and banging metal objects together, creating a cacophony that finally penetrated the bear's aggressive state. The bear paused, blood visible on its claws and muzzle, and recognized that the situation had deteriorated. Rather than pressing deeper into the building, the animal turned and crashed back through the corridor, overturning equipment and leaving deep claw marks on the walls. It disappeared through the damaged door, retreating into the dense forest at a lumbering run. Staff members immediately converged on Smirnova's location, but the severity of her injuries made treatment impossible. Dr. Volkov and two nurses worked desperately to stabilize her, but Smirnova succumbed within minutes. The remaining staff secured the building by barricading all exterior doors and evacuated patients to the central treatment area. Local wildlife authorities arrived approximately 3 hours later, delayed by the extreme remoteness and poor road conditions. They examined the scene, documenting the damaged doors, blood trail, and the bear's entry points. The investigating officer noted that excessive food waste, compromised building security, narrow corridors, and Smirnova's sudden movement had created a deadly scenario. Regional officials launched an immediate search for the bear, though the dense forest made success unlikely. More importantly, authorities mandated immediate security improvements, including reinforced doors, proper waste management systems, and emergency protocols for wildlife intrusions. The changes came too late for Smirnova, whose death highlighted the vulnerability of frontier medical facilities in territories where human infrastructure existed as isolated islands within wilderness. Smirnova's colleagues struggled with the aftermath. Several staff members requested transfers to facilities in more developed areas. Though replacements proved difficult to recruit, the hospital continued operating because the alternative meant abandoning healthcare services for thousands of people. But the sense of security evaporated. Every unexpected sound generated immediate anxiety, and the knowledge that thin walls and aging doors represented the only barrier between civilization and creatures capable of overwhelming violence became impossible to ignore. The incident reinforced uncomfortable truths about life in remote regions where human presence remained tentative. Even spaces designated for healing could transform into arenas of predation when circumstances aligned, and the line between shelter and trap remained disturbingly thin. On March 14, 2018, the extreme northern reaches of Canada's Arctic territory presented conditions that challenged even the most experienced professionals in cold weather. Dr. Lucas Freeman, a 38-year-old glaciologist who also served as ski patrol leader for a small research station, prepared for what should have been a routine morning inspection of avalanche monitoring equipment. The temperature hovered around -32 degrees Celsius, and dense fog had rolled in overnight, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. The research station, established in the early 1990s to study the impacts of climate change on Arctic ice, was located on elevated terrain overlooking frozen inlets. The region served as critical hunting grounds for polar bears, particularly during spring months when seals congregated near breathing holes in the sea ice. These apex predators, with adult males regularly exceeding 600 kilograms, possessed a strength that made them arguably the most dangerous land mammals on Earth. Freeman's team that morning included cartographer Sienna Dalewood, 29, and equipment technician Rafe Hollister, 31. Their objective involved inspecting avalanche detection markers positioned approximately 3 kilometers from the main station along a slope overlooking an inlet system. The markers required regular maintenance to ensure data accuracy and reliability. The trio departed shortly after dawn, traveling on 2 snowmobiles loaded with replacement batteries, diagnostic equipment, and emergency supplies. The journey proceeded without incident initially. Freeman navigated the lead snowmobile with Dalewood riding behind him, while Hollister followed on the second machine pulling a small equipment sled. The fog created an eerie atmosphere, muffling sounds and transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions. They reached the marker site around 9:30 and began the inspection process, working efficiently despite the brutal cold. None of them noticed the polar bear until it emerged from the fog bank with shocking suddenness. The animal, a massive male probably exceeding 700 kilograms, had been hunting seals along the frozen inlet below when it detected the unusual activity on the slope above. Polar bears possessed predatory instincts honed over millennia, and unlike brown or black bears, they actively hunted large prey, including humans, when the opportunity presented itself. The bear charged upslope without warning. Its yellowed white fur appeared almost spectral in the fog as it covered the ground with deceptive speed. Freeman, who happened to be facing in the bear's direction while adjusting a sensor mount, shouted a warning that sent adrenaline surging through all 3 team members. They scrambled toward the snowmobiles, but the bear reached them first. The animal's initial impact targeted the nearest snowmobile. A massive paw swipe connected with the machine's side, tipping the vehicle partially onto its side. The attached equipment sled overturned completely, spilling tools and supplies down the slope. Hollister, who had been reaching for the ignition, tumbled backward and collided with an ice-covered outcrop. Freeman grabbed the emergency flare gun from his snowmobile's storage compartment and fired directly toward the bear. The flare ignited with a brilliant red explosion of light and sparks, striking the snow approximately 2 meters from the bear's position. The bear flinched away from the flare but did not retreat. Instead, the animal began circling the team's position with calculated patience that was somehow more terrifying than outright aggression. It moved around the perimeter, testing different approach angles, its small, dark eyes evaluating options. Each time it shifted position, someone had to reorient to maintain visual contact. Dalewood managed to right Hollister's snowmobile while Freeman fired 2 additional flares, but the bear had apparently grown accustomed to the noise and light. Hollister, having recovered from his initial fall, discovered he had suffered a deep laceration along his left arm and substantial bruising across his ribs. Blood soaked through his outer layer, the bright red stark against the white landscape. The injury increased the bear's interest, perhaps triggering additional predatory instincts. The animal moved closer, approaching to within 5 meters before Freeman discharged another flare that finally forced it back several paces. The situation deteriorated into a nightmarish standoff that consumed nearly 15 agonizing minutes. The slope's geography worked against the team. Steep, ice-covered terrain extended above and below their position, offering no viable escape routes. The fog prevented them from seeing potential refuge locations, and starting the snowmobiles for a high-speed retreat risked triggering a final charge. The bear seemed to recognize their trapped circumstances, displaying patience and tactical awareness that Freeman found deeply unsettling. Temperature became an additional enemy. Standing relatively motionless in -32-degree conditions drained body heat rapidly, and Hollister's injury compounded his vulnerability to hypothermia. Dalewood positioned herself near him, sharing body heat while Freeman maintained watch on the circling bear. Each minute felt impossibly long, punctuated by the bear's occasional test approaches and Freeman's decreasing supply of flares. Salvation arrived from an unexpected quarter. A second research team, delayed on their own scheduled patrol, finally departed the station, traveling along a parallel route. The sound of their approaching snowcat, a larger tracked vehicle, carried through the fog. The bear, upon hearing this new element, apparently decided the effort required to continue its siege exceeded potential rewards. The animal turned and loped away into the fog, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. The rescue team reached Freeman's group within 5 minutes, having heard the commotion and altered course to investigate. They immediately loaded Hollister aboard the snowcat for emergency medical treatment, while Freeman and Dalewood recovered salvageable equipment. The return journey proceeded with maximum caution, everyone intensely aware that the bear could be anywhere in the surrounding fog. Station medical staff treated Hollister's injuries, determining that while the lacerations required extensive stitching and the bruising was severe, he would recover fully. The psychological impact proved more challenging. All 3 team members struggled with the aftermath, experiencing disrupted sleep patterns and anxiety during subsequent outdoor work. The incident prompted comprehensive reviews of Arctic Patrol protocols, with authorities emphasizing that polar bears represented uniquely dangerous predators whose hunting behavior differed fundamentally from that of other bear species. Freeman found himself profoundly affected by the encounter's duration and the bear's calculated approach. The animal had not simply attacked and retreated, but had actively sieged their position, demonstrating problem-solving capabilities and patience that elevated it beyond a simple predator. The experience reinforced what Freeman had understood intellectually, but now grasped viscerally. In the Arctic, humans existed as potential prey rather than dominant species, and survival often depended on factors beyond skill or preparation. On October 7, 2020, the remote wilderness of northwestern Montana displayed the raw beauty that drew serious hunters from across the continent. Mark Sullivan, a 44-year-old construction contractor from Idaho, and his longtime friend Jason Keller, 39, had secured permits for the early elk season in a region known for its exceptional hunting opportunities and significant grizzly bear populations. The area was characterized by steep valleys, dense conifer forests, and alpine meadows that retained much of their primordial character. Sullivan and Keller had invested considerable time and effort into their expedition. They had scouted the territory during the summer months, identifying a promising valley where elk signs suggested regular movement patterns. They constructed a tree blind, an elevated platform secured roughly 4 meters above ground in a cluster of mature Douglas firs, overlooking a natural clearing. The blind, built from weathered lumber and camouflage netting, provided concealment and theoretical safety from ground-based threats. Both hunters possessed decades of combined experience and understood the inherent risks of pursuing game in grizzly country. The morning of October 7th arrived cold and clear, with temperatures barely above freezing. Sullivan and Keller reached their tree blind well before dawn, climbing the ladder and settling into position with their rifles and binoculars. They had deliberately positioned bait, a mixture of grain and salt, approximately 50 meters from the blind several days earlier, hoping to attract elk to the clearing during prime morning feeding hours. What they failed to appreciate fully was that such bait attracted more than their intended quarry. A massive male grizzly, weighing an estimated 630 kilograms, had discovered its bait site within hours of its placement. The bear had been feeding on the bait during nighttime hours, and more significantly, had been observing the hunter's routines. Grizzlies possessed remarkable intelligence and memory, capable of associating human presence with food sources. The hunters waited through the early morning hours, watching the clearing gradually brighten. Around 7:30, Keller whispered that he had detected movement at the clearing's eastern edge. Both men raised their binoculars, expecting to see elk, but instead observed a grizzly emerging from the tree line. The bear moved directly toward the bait with confident familiarity, clearly having claimed the food source as its own territory. Sullivan and Keller exchanged glances, recognizing their situation had become complicated. Standard protocol suggested remaining absolutely still and silent, allowing the bear to feed and depart naturally. The tree blind theoretically provided safety, as grizzlies rarely climbed to such heights without compelling motivation. However, this particular bear demonstrated behavior that deviated from expected patterns. After feeding briefly, the animal raised its head and appeared to scan the surrounding forest systematically. Its attention focused on the tree blind's location with unsettling precision. The bear began moving toward their position. Sullivan felt his pulse accelerate as the animal approached the base of their tree cluster. The bear paused, sniffed the air thoroughly, and continued its deliberate advance. Keller slowly reached for his rifle, though both men understood that shooting a grizzly without absolute justification would result in severe legal consequences. The bear reached the base of the trees supporting their blind and began circling the trunks, clearly aware of their presence above. It reared onto its hind legs, standing nearly 3 meters tall, and swiped at the blind's support structure. The wooden posts shuddered under the impact, and several branches snapped, tumbling to the forest floor. The bear dropped back to all fours, circled again, and repeated the test with increased force. Sullivan and Keller's theoretical safety had transformed into a trap. The bear's behavior suggested it was actively problem-solving, testing the structure's integrity. This was not a chance encounter, but a calculated approach by a predator that had identified potential competitors for its food source. The bear began climbing. Despite weighing over 600 kilograms, the animal ascended with remarkable capability, using its massive claws to grip the trunk and its powerful shoulders to propel itself upward. Sullivan shouted, hoping noise might deter the bear, but the animal continued its ascent. When the bear's head reached platform level, it swiped at the blind's canvas walls, tearing through the material as though it were tissue paper. Keller fired his rifle into the air, the sharp crack echoing through the valley. The bear flinched, but did not retreat. Instead, it hauled more of its bulk onto the platform's edge, the wooden structure groaning under the additional weight. Sullivan attempted to move toward the ladder on the opposite side, but the confined space and the bear's positioning made escape impossible. The bear's next swipe caught Sullivan across his chest and right arm as he tried to use his rifle as a defensive barrier. The weapon flew from his grip, clattering down through branches to the ground. Sullivan screamed, blood immediately soaking through his jacket. Keller, positioned in the blind's corner, had nowhere to retreat. He pulled the trigger once more, the bullet striking close enough to at last provoke the bear. The bear, perhaps recognizing that its position on the unstable platform made it vulnerable, or finally startled by the proximity of the gunfire, released its grip and dropped back to the ground. However, rather than fleeing, it resumed circling the tree base, occasionally rearing up and swiping at the supports. The siege continued for another agonizing 12 minutes, with Sullivan bleeding heavily and Keller trying desperately to apply pressure to his friend's wounds while maintaining awareness of the bear's position. The standoff finally ended when the wind shifted, carrying the sound and scent of an approaching ATV from a neighboring hunting camp approximately 2 kilometers away. The bear, after a final assessment, turned and crashed through the underbrush, disappearing into the dense forest. Keller immediately radioed for emergency assistance, providing coordinates and describing Sullivan's injuries as critical. Emergency medical helicopter response in such remote terrain required nearly 90 minutes. Keller managed to get Sullivan down from the blind and administered field first aid, but the severity of the injuries, combined with blood loss and shock, proved overwhelming. Sullivan died before the helicopter arrived, despite Keller's desperate efforts. The trauma extended beyond the physical wounds. Sullivan had suffered massive internal injuries from the initial swipe that Keller had been unable to assess or treat in field conditions fully. Wildlife investigators who examined the scene later that day found extensive evidence of the bear's prolonged presence. Tracks indicated the animal had been in the immediate area for hours before the attack. Claw marks scored into the tree trunks reached heights that surprised even experienced bear biologists, suggesting the bear had been systematically testing the structure's stability. Keller survived physically but carried profound psychological scars. He provided detailed testimony during the investigation, his account painting a disturbing picture of a grizzly that had adapted to human presence through tactical assessment. Authorities emphasized that the incident highlighted how apex predators in regions with minimal human presence sometimes develop hunting strategies that incorporate humans as either competition or potential prey. An animal of immense strength damaged the tree. After the attack, regulations on baiting and blind construction were revised to address the danger of attracting grizzlies near fixed hunting spots. Sullivan's death proved that even skilled hunters weren't safe when positioned between bears and food sources. Keller never hunted again. The memory of being trapped as the bear tore through the blind haunted him. Within 6 months, he relocated to suburban Oregon, leaving the wilderness and its untamed rulers behind.